The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
From Mallory Square in Key West to the Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee and all points beyond, you're listening to the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com, your source for all things related to the craft beer community in the Sunshine State. And now your host, Dave Butler.
It's time for part 2 of our 3-parter here on the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com. This is Dave, your host and author. We're going to get right into it here in a few minutes, but first, make sure to do the things that we always tell you to do, which is to like and subscribe on your podcasting app of choice. Hopefully you are listening to us on Apple or Google or Stitcher or something. Make sure to follow that podcast. And if you can leave a review, kind of give us a big, juicy 5-star review. That would be greatly appreciated. You can also follow us on social media. We're at Florida Beer Blog on Instagram and Twitter, at FL Beer Blog on Facebook. And if you're on Facebook, go ahead and also find FPN Insiders. The Florida Beer Podcast is a part of the Florida Podcast Network. Very proud part of it, I might add. And by following the FPN Insiders page, you'll get all the news and information about the newest shows that are coming to the network. We also have websites. Florida Podcast Network is obviously the main site. That's floridapodcastnetwork.com. We are at floridabeerpodcast.com, and obviously our sister site, the one that started it all, floridabeerblog.com. And if you want to, I want you to go through and check out some of the posts that we did on Odd Breed Wild Ales. They've been around for quite some time. I let Matt know that his was the greatest Ode Bruin that I still have had that was made here in the United States. And I'm not going to back down from it because it was that good. So yes, we are going back to part 2 of 3 of our interview with Matt Manthe, owner and brewmaster and incredibly knowledgeable beer and microbial human being at Odd Breed Wild Ales. We got a little bit of his background and his interest and introduction to both beer and microbes and kind of combining the two. We're going to talk a little bit more about his background. We're going to talk about Bruzy getting there and opening up his new place and all sorts of other fun stuff. And eventually you'll get a little bit deeper insight into the man and the beers. And trust me, you're going to enjoy both of those if you have not had the chance to try them yet. If you have, you know what I'm talking about. You know they're absolutely fantastic. And regardless, still want you to enjoy this next episode, part 2 of 3 with Matt Manthe, Odd Breed Wild Ales, and enjoy. Yeah, and I kind of wanted to talk about the location because it's, I guess when you take a look at this little section of Pompano Beach, it's a gorgeous kind of old town feel. It looks like they're still in the process of growing it, but there's a lot of potential here. What was it about here that made it so attractive to you?
Yeah, this little area definitely has a lot of potential. This was the original downtown Pompano Beach. And so across the street from my brewery here was one of the first hotels in Pompano. Right next to that was the First Bank, which is the building on the corner right there. And, you know, I opened here for a number of reasons, one of which was that the space was more or less the right size. It was and is well insulated. I have a good AC system in place. I keep the brewery at 69 degrees in here year round, which is very cold for South Florida. I need that cold temperature and a consistent temperature because of the beer aging in the barrels. But I needed a place that was zoned industrial. I needed a place that had enough parking. I needed a place where the city was happy to have me here, where the landlord didn't have an issue with an alcohol producer. You know, I'm actually pretty close to the Baptist church right here. And the city changed some of the zoning to allow me to open a brewery here. And
It's amazing. I've heard so many people talk about horror stories with the city, and I would assume that, because you weren't the first brewery in the city, that they could see the positive economic benefits. You had a little bit of hope.
Yeah. And that was also a major draw. When I was first looking for a brewery location, I was living in Delray Beach at the time, and I initially wanted to open up in Boynton, in part because they had Due South, they had Copper Point, and I didn't want to be the only brewery in town, in part because I'm a niche brewery. I thought that it would be good for foot traffic, for people visiting, if they could go to a city and visit, multiple breweries in a relatively close area. But also, I didn't want to deal with a city that didn't understand anything about beer and breweries.
Gotcha.
I did talk with the city in Delray a couple times. They were not helpful at all. They were actually very dismissive of me and my project. And I talked with them both before and after Saltwater opened. And I had basically the same experience with them. And that was a huge turnoff. And so, wasn't interested in being the only brewery in town. I know that the kind of beer that I make isn't for everyone. And, I feel like a lot of breweries open up with this theme, this concept of being like the all-you-can-eat buffet that carries every type of food imaginable. And meanwhile, all the food ends up being kind of mediocre. I've made tons of different styles of beer. I'm really passionate about traditional German lagers. It's one of the reasons why I have a bunch of great traditional German lagers on my guest menu. Mm-hmm. I have Bavik Super Pils on draft all the time. I pour that out of a Lucre faucet. I think that beer is amazing. And I do some collabs with other breweries, and they're usually lagers. And
interesting.
But I wanted to focus exclusively on barrel-aged wild ales. It's what I'm really passionate about. I like the challenge of it. I'm also maybe a little bit of a hoarder, and I like the idea that I make these beers and they age really well. And so I can revisit them, several years later, and they slowly evolve into something else that you may or may not like. It's a personal thing, but you don't have the issues with oxidation or with, just off flavors that pop up in typical beer styles simply because they're old. And so being able to operate this brewery as a hyper niche brewery is just something that I really enjoy.
How difficult to sell was it for the community here in Pompano Beach?
Oh, it's still very difficult to sell. My regular customers, most of them are not from Pompano. I'm open Thursday through Sunday. I do the majority of the taproom business on Saturdays and Sundays, but I get a ton of people who come to visit us that are from out of town, out of state, out of the country. About a month ago, I had 4 people in here that were from Switzerland. And I said, how'd you guys know about Odd Breed? Why'd you guys stop by? And they said, oh, well, we love your beer. We tried it in Switzerland. And I do distribute a little bit of beer in Switzerland. And so it was really cool that they were here in Fort Lauderdale on business. And they decided to stop by Pompano Beach specifically because they liked my beer and had it, back home.
That's both amazing and I guess a little nerve-wracking at the same time to know that the beer is going to be, your name is getting so far and that's bringing people back in.
Yeah. Well, and that's also one of the things that I really love about these types of beers is that they are pretty resilient. They travel well. Back when I was working at Thomas Creek, we did distribute to maybe about a dozen states, and we did a lot of contract brews as well. And, we're making, for the most part, more typical styles. Amber Ale and Irish Red Ale were our best sellers, but we also did a Doppelbock, we did a Pilsner, we did a couple different IPAs, and most of the contracts that we did were more along the lines of those same types of styles. And the thing that I would probably hate most, especially when I was head brewer there, was going out to a beer store or a bar and seeing that the beer that they had from us was old and it didn't taste the way that it should have. The Total Wine up there, they would do a bulk buy for our Class 5 IPA, and they would get it down to $7.49 a 6-pack. This is back when all craft beer 6-packs were less than $8, or less than $9, I should say. But so everywhere else, that 6-pack was $7.99. At Total Wine, it was $7.49, and they had a huge literal pyramid of it right when you would walk in at the Total Wine in Greenville. And you check the dates on it, and it's like, this IPA is 9 months old. As a consumer, I would rather pay 51 cents more for that 6-pack and have it be fresh than have this monstrosity of, these old beers collecting dust on the shelf. And as a producer, that really hurts you. And, for me to know that my beer gets out and it travels pretty far sometimes here, the beer that I'm making at Odd Breed, to know that it's going to travel well and that people are going to open that bottle years down the road. For one, it puts some added pressure on me that, I think a lot of brewers have this mentality where maybe a batch that they made wasn't all that great or wasn't exactly the way they wanted it to be. And especially if they're a small brewery, and especially if they're a small brewery that's serving everything direct to the consumer, they say, oh, well, this wasn't my best effort, but it'll be gone in a few weeks. And then, it'll be back to a different batch and I'll make sure that one's better. I don't really have that luxury in the sense in that once I put a beer into a bottle and it leaves my doors, somebody may be holding on to that beer for years. Yeah. And, I have some people that reach out to me and after they've tried a beer and usually they tell me they really like it. And, and I'm always happy to hear that. And that's also a good reminder for me that, hey, this stuff isn't going to be gone immediately. I really makes me want to focus more on every batch of beer that I put out and making sure that it is right.
Mm-hmm. So you've got the location, you've got tons of liquid that's doing its thing. You then decided to enter into a partnership with Barrel of Monks in Boca, knowing that you theoretically, with the amount of cred that you have, you could have gone anywhere. You could have continued with 26 Degree or whatnot. What was it about Barrel of Monks that made you decide, hey, let's work with them?
Yeah, so I've been friends with the guys at Barrel of Monks for a long time now. Bill McPhee was one of the first people that I befriended when I moved to South Florida. And then shortly after that, or actually, no, I guess first it was Kevin Abbott who introduced me to Bill McPhee. Kevin Abbott was the longtime brewer at Funky Buddha back at the lounge when they first got started. Also, I worked with Kevin when I was a consultant for Funky Buddha to help them open their production facility. But I like the guys at Barrel of Monks a lot. They have an awesome brew house that really is perfect for the style of beers that I make. It allows me to do turbid mashes, decoctions, step mashes. Basically, it gives me these tools to make beer the way that I do that allows it to age the way that I want it to. And a lot of other brew houses don't have that kind of capability. But, I originally started this brewery with Daniel Naumko. And, we never intended to get a brew house. And so my first batches, aside from what I brewed, one batch at 26 Degrees, I brewed two batches at Bang & Banjo, but everything else that I brewed has been at Barrel of Monks. And when Daniel wanted to leave the business back in 2019, I wasn't prepared financially to buy him out, nor did I really want to, because my focus is on the production side of beer. And now I do a lot of other stuff too, besides just making the beer. But I liked what the guys at Barrel of Monks had going on. So I encouraged Dan to sell his shares to some of the owners at Barrel of Monks. And so we are two separate LLCs. We have separate brewing licenses. For all practical purposes, there isn't a partnership because their LLC is not Barrel of Monks. LLC is owning part of Odd Breed. It's three individuals at Barrel of Monks that own some of Odd Breed.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. Now, what I find interesting is when you had started brewing some of your stuff at 26 Degree, it was fermenting over there, correct?
Correct.
And so legally, what did you have to go through to get the beer from what is literally right down the street? And I realize that I'm only pointing for you because nobody else can see me pointing right now, but literally maybe a mile down the road over to here requires more legal paperwork, more jumping through hoops than it would be to get the liquid that you're making over at Barrel of Monks and bringing it over here, even though that crosses not only city lines, but county lines as well.
Correct. Yeah. So there was no beer being packaged at their facility. It's not in a tax determination tank. So it's not a finished product. For all paperwork purposes, all the beer was produced here.
Which I find interesting. Was that intentional? Or was there ever any desire to hey, they've got space, let's just move the production there and keep this location here in Pompano Beach as maybe just a tap room? Or did you always want to actually do the brewing process there, but when it comes time to the fermentation and all the things that you learned for many, many years, to do that here in this particular facility, so that way you could sort of have it be your own control?
Yeah, I mean, ideally I would own my own brew house too. there are some breweries within our niche that actually just have some other guy brew their recipe for them and then they deliver the wort. And I'm a lot more hands-on than that. I go to Barrel of Monks and I get my grain shipped over there. Basically, I get the grain for 2 batches that I plan on brewing shipped over there just a few days before I brew. And I bring my own hops over there. I bring my own tank on the back of a trailer. I bring my hoses, all my parts and gaskets and clamps and everything. And so it's a lot of work, but I'm the one who's there on the brew house, making the wort. And if I'm going to make this beer that's going to take that long to age in barrels and then bottle conditioning and keg conditioning, I want to be involved in every step of the process. So
it's not a contract wort procedure. You are literally the person doing it over there.
Yeah. As far as the government is concerned, I'm a brewery just like any other brewery is. Even though I don't own a brew house, I'm still the one who's producing the liquid. I still have to produce my receipts for the ingredients that I produce or the ingredients that I use to produce my beer. But all of the fermentation and packaging occurs here on site. And that's really what the government is concerned with. They want to know where the beer is packaged, where it's not technically a finished alcoholic product until it's in its package here for me, meaning bottles and kegs, because I don't have what are called tax determination tanks, which in a typical brewery would be like a bright beer tank, which is typically, metered out. So you know what the volume in the vessel is. That's what the tax collectors come and check. When the people from DBPR come by here, they don't understand what's going on. And they're like, wait, this is a brewery? It's like, yeah.
Nice. So with the recipes that you have, because there are so many moving parts and you have such a long game to play with a lot of these beers and aging, how much of it is something that you have a plan for before you ever pour malted grain into any sort of a tank? How much of it is you written out, you know what you're going to do, you know what you're kind of looking for, and then how much of it is just sort of on the fly deciding, day of, maybe we'll put this in, maybe we'll put that in?
So I don't brew very often, and I brew relatively large batches. And so when I decide what I want to brew, there are a few kind of standard recipes that I have, but most of what I brew is a one-off. And of those, well, basically of all the beers that I brew, there's a certain percentage, I don't even know exactly what it is, maybe 40%, maybe 60%, something like that end up being a beer that I brew that is designed to be unblended, meaning one brew day goes into barrels for X period of time, and then that's the beer. But sometimes I'll do different things with that particular beer. So, for example, I have a recipe for a strong golden ale that I call Artistic Bugs. I've done 2 batches of it now, but I've also done 2 batches of dry hopped Artistic Bugs, which is that same base beer aged in barrels for about 2 years. And then it's dry hopped heavily with whole cone American hops. Batch 1 of that beer was different than batch 2 because I used different dry hops, in part because when I'm tasting the beer out of the barrel, I decide what flavors I like, which ones I want to accentuate, which ones I want to develop new layers of flavor on top of what's already existing. And then, of course, I'm also at the mercy of what do I actually have access to? What can I buy? Because I don't have cylindrical tanks here or a glycol chiller, I use whole cone hops for dry hopping. I also like the flavor of the whole cone hops more. But, I've also done versions of that beer that was aged in Syrah barrels and then had Syrah grapes added. I did a version that was aged in Mezcal barrels with agave nectar added. So I can do various different kind of spin-offs from that particular base wort, even though it's not blended with anything else. But a lot of what I do is brewing a beer basically with the intention of using it as a tool for blending. And gotcha. So what I mean by that is I'll kind of take inventory of what I have in barrels from the standpoint of flavor profiles. And so if I know that I have a lot of beer in barrels that has, say, a moderate to high level of acidity, then I know that I want to brew something that is going to have less acidity that I can use as a blending tool. If I have a lot of beer in barrels that maybe has more of an earthy kind of hay or leather type flavor from the Brettanomyces, then I know that I want to get some more tropical fruit and citrus esters into the mix. And so I'll brew a recipe specifically to accentuate those kind of flavors. When I'm brewing my lambic-inspired base beer, I also decide how long I plan on aging that beer in barrels. And so if it's a version that I want to re-ferment with fruit, it's designed to only age in barrels for about a year. In that case, I make a beer that is a little bit higher on the hopping level to restrict some of the acidification that comes from re-fermenting fruit. But I'll also mash in at a relatively low temperature to create more easily fermentable sugars. That way the fermentation is finished faster. Whereas if I, am making a beer that I want to age in barrels for 3 years or so, then I'll mash in rather at warmer temperatures to create longer chain sugars, and that slows down the fermentation. It makes a beer that ages more gracefully in barrels.
Gotcha. And it's interesting that you talked about blending the way that you did, because growing up, especially when it came to wine, I had always been told that blending was just a way to use bad batches to make something that was cheap and easy and sent out. But what you're saying is basically that you're blending to create a superior product, and you're actually creating the separate ingredients, start with the base, and then creating something to specifically slot in and create a flavor profile, and not just, here's some garbage, I don't want to dump it. Let's put it all together.
Yeah. So ultimately my goal is to make the best beer I can. Right. And so I've talked with some other brewers that are within my niche, and they make certain beers that they don't blend ever. And they'll even talk about how, well, this is a beer that's designed to be unblended. And, this year the acidity on it is higher. And well, that's okay to a certain extent. Consistency with these types of beers is a difficult thing to achieve. I think that balance and complexity really should always be your main goals, or at least that's what it is for me. And so I'm not as reluctant to blend if I think that it's going to make the product better. And I think ultimately that's what everybody should do. I don't know. I guess I'm a little bit biased, but I know some people that have this aversion to blending, and I'm really not sure why. Even when I make a batch of beer and I fill up 4 of my puncheons, usually the differences between those puncheons is relatively subtle. Sometimes it's not noticeable at all. Sometimes it's actually pretty pronounced. And, I sometimes will blend multiple barrels together of that same beer because I think that it kind of evens things out better. If you have beer that's bad or something that's just really out of balance, the only thing that you achieve by mixing other beer in with that is that you have more bad beer. And so it is easier to a certain extent to cut your losses depending on what it is that's out of balance or that you're not a big fan of. Sometimes you have to accept that, hey, if I don't like this, why would I give it to my customers?
Yeah. I do find the puncheons to be interesting because when you go into most breweries, especially some big ones that I've been to, they have barrel rooms, but they are barrels, significantly smaller, almost always bourbon, just floor to ceiling. Whereas with these, the puncheons, this is their first use, correct?
So I get these puncheons from wineries. So I have 39 of these puncheons. They're 500 liters. That's 132 gallons each. I got 20 of them from a winery in Napa where they held various types of red wine for 2 to 4 seasons. And I got the other 19 from a winery in Italy where they all held Sangiovese wine. The winemakers sell them to me. They call them neutral barrels, but there's a saying, I don't remember who it was one of the old lambic brewers who said, oak is always oak. And the point being that even though the barrel may be considered neutral to a winemaker, it still has some oak flavor left. It still has plenty of life left in it. I'm not aging in the puncheons to achieve an oak flavor. Yes, a lot of my beers do have an oak flavor to them because they spend a long time in barrels. But these larger barrels, they're not like a bourbon barrel, and that, first of all, the flavor profile of American oak and French oak is completely different. But those bourbon barrels, they're heavy char. They oftentimes refer to them as alligator char if they're very highly charred, because it looks like an alligator's back. All the wood is blistered up. That blistering process, it allows for a lot of oxygen ingress. The smaller barrels also have a lot of surface area, meaning that there's a lot of beer that's in contact with oak. And these larger vessels, the puncheons, there's less beer in contact with oak because the vessel is so much bigger. The staves themselves are also a lot thicker, which means that they let less oxygen in. I find that the beer ages slower in the larger barrels because I do use some standard size wine barrels occasionally as well. And in those standard size wine barrels, everything being equal as far as, the same beer, same brew date and all that, the wine barrels will always develop faster. They'll develop acidity quicker. They'll reach a terminal gravity faster than the larger barrels. Sometimes they end up with more unique flavors, but they're usually not as well rounded. I feel like it's almost more necessary to blend when you're coming out of those smaller barrels. But really the oak vessel itself is what is the home for my mixed culture of wild yeast and bacteria. There's a certain amount of oxygen ingress that the Pediococcus bacteria needs to be able to metabolize effectively, produce the desired amount of acidity in the beer. Brettanomyces also likes access to small amounts of oxygen. And so the beer would taste completely different if I were aging it in, say, stainless steel versus these French oak barrels, even if you weren't able to taste any French oak at all.
Do you still consider them to have enough of an impact on the beer to where it has to be treated as a separate ingredient, and you'll build the rest of the beer based on where you think it's going to age for however long it ages?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, the standard size barrels that I have here, the spirit barrels and the standard size wine barrels, I use those primarily as secondary aging vessels, meaning that the beer starts its aging process in the large French oak barrels. It's nearly finished with its fermentation. It's essentially basically a finished beer. And then I'll put it into a unique spirit barrel or a unique wine barrel or something to pick up additional flavor from that type of oak, whether it be American oak, which is typically used in spirit barrels, or French oak is typically used for wine. It'll pick up some of that oak flavor, but more importantly, it picks up the flavor from whatever the previous contents of that barrel are. And so, whether that's like peated scotch or mezcal or tawny port or gin, something like that, it usually picks up that flavor relatively quickly within just a few months, whereas the fermentation itself needs more time than that. And so that's why I'll make sure that the bulk of that fermentation aging process is in the French oak puncheons first. Also, I only use those spirit barrels once. I use them once, I get that good flavor out of them. After that, I'm not interested in reusing those barrels. They just don't have any more of the flavor that I want.
All right, that's 2 down, 1 to go. We got a lot of great information coming up in the next episode, including some of the new releases that he has coming up in the near future. What's nice about him is with a lot of the bottle conditioning that he does, he already knows what he's going to be selling months down the road because it's already in package. And you're going to hear about that on next week's episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com. My name is Dave. I'm your host and author. Our intro announcer is Jeff Brozovich. Field producer is Steve Pekala. Executive producer Grand High Poobah, and creator of the Florida Podcast Network, of which we're a proud member, is Jemmy Legagneur. Make sure to follow us on FloridaPodcastNetwork.com, FloridaBeerPodcast.com, and of course, FloridaBeerBlog.com. Why would you be reading anything else? And make sure to follow us on socials. Make sure to like and subscribe to our podcast, and make sure to tell all of your friends. It really does help. We will be back next week with episode 3 of Matt Manthe at Odd Breed Wild Ales. Trust me, it's going to be a great conclusion. Hopefully you've been enjoying the series so far, and you'll be enjoying some more of it later on. We will see you next week. In the meantime, drink Florida Craft.